Good morning. Hello, everybody. I normally don't get as nice of an introduction, so I have a couple things to talk about myself here. But before I do, I just want to say thank you for having me here, actually. This is the first literary festival or event that I've been invited to talk at about Twine. And I think it's really cool because I think there is a lot of crossover between Twine and the literary world. Here are my things that kind of talk about what was just said. I have been making games for about 2 decades. It's hard to quantify that because when I started making games, I did it just for fun. I wasn't particularly serious about it. But also, most of the games I've made have been text-based for more than those in that time. And the reason why I'm here probably mostly is because I made Twine, a tool for making text-based games, nearly 15 years ago. That's kind of mind-boggling to think about. In my talk, the title at first that I came up with for my talk originally was Why Twine? Why use it? Not why did I make it, but why use it? And over time, it sort of evolved in my head to why make small art? Or why make small games? And the argument that I want to try to make to you today, to everybody sitting in the audience and folks watching at home or wherever they are, I think everyone listening or hearing this talk right now can make a game and should try it. And I know there are a lot of game designers already in the audience. And so hopefully, if you're just starting out, I have some advice for you. And if you're a super experienced professional person, hopefully some of this will resonate. I want to begin by talking about what I want to call the curse of Unity and Unreal. If you're not familiar, Unity and Unreal are free engines, free game engines. They handle all the boring, complicated aspects of making games like graphics, sound, all these really crunchy physics, all these really difficult things when you're first getting off the ground, when you want to make a game, they do that for you. And this is the promise they make to you. This is a game, Cyberpunk. It was built with Unreal. You can make this, probably. This is Fortnite, also made with Unreal. You could make that too. Outer Wilds, built with Unity. You can make a game that looks like that, right? This is Life is Strange, also, I believe, built with Unity. And the amazing thing is you can do it for free. You can walk out of this room today, download these things, and make these games. But you can't. I'm sorry. You probably can't. I would love you to prove me wrong, but I don't believe you can. I don't believe I could either. And I've been working or trying on this stuff for a long time. The reason why I believe that's true is, so I'm not a movie or a film person, but I did a little bit of research. This is an IMAX MSM 9802 film camera, or so I believe it is. If it isn't, I apologize. I tried to do my homework on this. Normally, it costs about 16 grand to rent one of these cameras for a week. Forget buying one, right? Like that's just, you got to ask for that price, right? What if I gave you a camera? What if I gave you one of these 16 grand cameras for free today? Could you make Oppenheimer? No, that's silly, right? If I said that, you'd be like, no, right? But I think some people, the impression sometimes we walk away with things is that, yeah, I can build using the same tools and that these big, complicated projects build, and I'm going to end up with the same results. Because that's not really true. They're all a ton of other skills that you need to make a quote unquote AAA game. These big, popular games that are played by millions of people. This isn't an exhaustive list, but just running through it, you need to be able to do 3D modeling, level design, narrative design, programming, sound design, and last but definitely not least, quality assurance, constantly overlooked in game making, i.e., does this actually work the way it should? QA people are constantly overlooked and kind of undervalued, in my opinion. Anyways, there's all these things that are sort of invisible in this sort of scheme to a certain degree, especially when you're first starting out. Baldur's Gate 3, you might have heard of it, very popular game last year. Any guesses how many people are credited on Baldur's Gate?
2,000.
You're very close, 2,300. By way of comparison, Oppenheimer only credits about 250 people. It's a little controversial because Oppenheimer, when I looked it up, actually doesn't credit all the visual effects artists. So this number is probably underestimated, as it were. But anyway, it's just like you think about the number of people who worked on this. It's kind of ludicrous to try to set out and compare your work and try to create something that takes thousands of people years to build. And the thing is, you start out, oftentimes people will do that. will set out to build these enormous things, these grand ideas. They won't succeed. And then, unfortunately, the conclusion they draw is they're not good at making games. And there you are completely wrong. This is not just something that happens in the games field. This is a quotation from Ira Glass. You might know him. He's the host of This American Life, a bunch of things. And he's talking about creativity in general. He says, nobody tells this to people who are beginners. I wish someone told me. All of us who do creative work, we get into it because we have good taste. But there's this gap. For the first couple of years you make stuff, it's just not that good. It's trying to be good. It has potential, but it's not. But your taste, the thing that got you into the game, is still killer. And your taste is why your work disappoints you. A lot of people never get past this phase, and they quit. I hit this wall in my own sort of development as a game maker. So when I was in undergraduate school, I loved this weird, tiny little game nobody had heard of called Silent Hill. At that point, it did not have 4 or 5 or however many sequels or anything like that. It didn't have 2 movies or anything like that. It was this weird little horror game that I loved. And because it was this mysterious thing, a whole lot of things that didn't make sense, but it had this sense of something is going on here in this game, in this story, and I really want to uncover it. Anyways, so did this friend of mine, Joel, and we were both English majors. But the thing about being an English major, of course, I think this is still true. You still have to take required courses. And for us, it was baby physics at 8:30 a.m., Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And at the time, we thought this is the dumbest idea. I hate, how dare you make me go to class at 8:30 in the morning. But as we were walking across the campus to get to this early morning class, we both were playing Silent Hill sort of simultaneously. And we were talking about, what do you think the game, what is going on in this game? And how did you solve this puzzle? And because of that, it sort of emerged that we both had always wanted to make games, and we're thinking about it. And we thought, well, okay, let's try that. Why not? This vastly predated the days. I think maybe Unreal existed, but in a very, very different form. It was not in a form you could just download and use. My own experience was, in addition to being an English major, I was a computer science minor, also a creative writing minor. And the one piece of relevant experience I had maybe to building a game, at least the kind of game that Silent Hill was, is I had taken a single class in C++, programming language. And the only programs I did in that were to output text, no graphics whatsoever, nothing about performance, physics, forget it. I was just doing basic algorithms, right? So we did what I think a lot of people do, is they sit down and we drew up what we would call now a design document. But we didn't know what it was called. We just made it up. And we didn't have Google Docs. We walked up the hill both ways. It was a Word document or something like that. And we designed together what we would call now an immersive adventure game. It was we imagined a big world with monsters in it and items to find and puzzles to solve and all kinds of stuff. And then because we didn't know what we were doing, we added time travel to our idea. So this complicated things both from a mechanical implementation standpoint and also a storytelling standpoint. Even if you know nothing about making games, a time travel story is inherently way harder to tell than any other, maybe. And of course, as soon as we did that, we got completely stuck, right? We had a bunch of really interesting ideas, and I think I maybe wrote some code to represent the concept of an item you might pick up, or a monster with hit points or something like that. But nothing actually we made no progress, really, and we got completely stuck. I don't want you to quit. I didn't quit. The story sort of has a happy ending. I haven't been making games with Joel for 20 solid years. It's been off and on, but we still make games. And we kind of muddled our way through the hard way and figured out what was within, our own capabilities and all those kinds of things. And we grew kind of creatively together. It's really, we make games together now. So I don't want you to hit the same wall, and I don't want you to have the same kind of awful experience if you can avoid it. So what I want to say is, you can't make Fortnite. I don't believe you're capable of it. I think you can make something more interesting than Fortnite. And what do I mean by that? What do I mean by more interesting? The thing about a game like Fortnite is it's maximal, I would argue. First of all, it's designed to entertain as many people as possible across the entire globe. It's designed to get people to play that Fortnite as much as time, or to spend as much time as possible with it. because ultimately its goal is to get you to spend money on it, right? And to fuel the ongoing existence of Fortnite. If you're not familiar somehow, Fortnite is not a game you just sort of buy off the shelf and you're done, engaging in a financial transaction. There's a currency system where you can buy cosmetics and unlock gameplay and all these other things. And there's all these pieces to it. It's trying to do everything. It's mass entertainment. It's sort of, in my opinion, it's sort of the equivalent of a Marvel movie or something like a summer blockbuster in general. And I think where there's space for you in the audience, is to make personal art. And I mean personal in a couple different dimensions. First of all, obviously, who it's by. It's very, very difficult if you're working on these large games. I think the people who have worked in those games would agree with me. It's very hard to have much of an impact in what is sort of there on the page or in the game. Sort of as way of comparison, a while back, there's a making of documentary for Frozen 2. It's on Disney Plus. You can watch it yourself. And the thing that was interesting is they profiled one of the animators, and she had something really exciting happen to her. It was a big career moment. She got to animate about 5 seconds of this movie. And I don't know off the top of my head how long Frozen 2 is, but I'm going to guess like 2 hours-ish. This was a big deal that she got to do this. Obviously, if in these smaller projects, you have way more impact. You have more of a chance for your own voice to emerge. Also, it can be personal in the sense of what it is, what the game and the thing that you make is about. You can tell a personal story. You can share a personal perspective. And finally, who it's for. I think this is the most neglected aspect, of personal, at least personal games, is that because we see games, these are things, again, that millions of people either play, download, buy, whatever. We forget that we can make games for just a few people. We think you make mittens for your granddaughter, right? Or you write a poem for your boyfriend. You can make a game potentially for just one person. There could be a bunch just for your friends. That's a thing you can do. And people sometimes forget that fact. And the thing is, this is not a new concept. This is a thing that people understand in other disciplines. It's funny, games are both simultaneously very old as a discipline and also relatively young. People have been playing games, obviously, for as long as there have been people. I don't mean emotional games, but I mean games with dice and things like that. At the same time, digital games are still a very young medium, right? Anyways, this idea of small personal things potentially exists, and we call them exercises, right? And I guess I'm arguing for working or creating game exercises. And so this is a thing that people understand, I think, more readily or is better understood in other media or other disciplines. That before you set out to create a large project, you do small things. If you want to be able to draw the human figure, you're going to start perhaps by drawing hands and focusing on just getting hands right, for example. And that's just part of the thing. Likewise, if you're interested in writing novels, I recommend writing poetry first. This was inflicted on me, actually, when I was lucky enough to. I went to a high school that had a magnet program. I'm not sure how common that is as a concept, but the gist was that in addition to English and social studies and math and science and all those normal kind of classes you would take in high school, I got to take a class regularly in creative writing. And that was really exciting. The first year I took it was kind of a free-for-all. I got to do all kinds of different writing. But then in my sophomore year, a new teacher became in charge of the program, and she decreed, Ms. Botto was her name, she decreed no matter what kind of writing you're interested in, for the next, and I wish I remembered, it was either the next semester or the next year, you will only write poetry. And I hated that because I didn't understand poetry. I didn't know how to write poetry. This was scary to me, very scary. And I was like, this sucks. How am I going to survive this? And the thing was, she was right. I am actually really grateful to my teacher, Ms. Botto, because as it turns out, poetry teaches you, or writing poetry teaches you a ton about how language works, how the sound of words, contributes to your understanding of them, how to create imagery, all these little building blocks. And by honing in on that, I got a million more tools in my toolbox, as it were, when I went to set out to create these bigger things. And I think the same is true for games as well. And the exciting part is that just like there are, there's free Unity and free Unreal, there's tons of free tools for making small games, and they're free. GB Studio, just to list a couple, GB Studio is a game, or a engine for making games for the original Game Boy, the one that came out in like the 1990s or whatever. Totally free to use. It's easy to pick up, and you can build whatever, it's a general purpose thing. Another one to look at is a platform called Pico 8. Pico 8 is similar to GB Studio in that you're building games for a console, except the Pico 8 console never existed. It's something that people made up. And it is a little more high performance, I guess, than the Game Boy in terms of the number of colors you get, screen resolution, stuff like that, but it's still heavily constrained. And you're not going to be able to build, you could build a version of Fortnite for sure in Pico 8, but it would be difficult to say the least. Those are general purpose. And I should say I have links to all these things at the end of my slides so that if you're curious, you'll be able to look at them. Bitsy these are more specific to particular genres or particular kinds of games. Bitsy it's hard to characterize. I almost would call it either an adventure game maker or an RPG maker, where you control a little character like that guy there at the bottom of the screen. You rock around and investigate things, talk to people potentially, progress a story. Puzzle script is sort of similar, except as the name kind of indicates, it's all about making puzzles, like Sokoban style stuff potentially, but things that get much more complicated. If you're interested in visual novels, Renpai is a really good way to do that. But of course, today I'm going to talk about Twine, because that's mine. But also, beyond that, I also think that it's important, or a good way to start with game making is with text. And this is the Fall for the Book Festival. Hopefully I don't have to kind of talk you too much into why text is a good idea, but let me make a little bit of an argument. This is a quotation from a person called Porpentine. She's an author who has worked in Twine quite a bit. She said or wrote, "Our global network, the internet, is composed of human minds uploaded into word form. On this plane, the word is the most potent unit of force. It costs a couple of keystrokes to control someone else's brain for a second, and longer if you do it right." Her essay, Creation Under Capitalism, I think is a really good read in general. Again, I have it linked at the end. And she talks a lot about why parser or other kind of text-based games worked for her and why she chooses to create in those formats. And I think it's just a good read in general. So high level, it takes about 15 minutes to teach people how to use Twine, but I'm just going to skip past the boring parts and give you the good parts. A Twine story is divided into passages. This square right here, this white square, is a passage. And you can think of it as basically a chunk of text that you see at one time. That when someone plays or reads your story, they see that text on the screen. If you want to make a link between two passages, you put two square brackets around some words, you make a link, and ta-da, you have a new passage. So here in my example, I'm confronted with a door. I can choose to open it. If you add more than one link to a passage, you've created this funny thing called a choice, right? And if you have a choice, you have a game. Sid Meier, you may have heard of him. He worked on this tiny game or designed this tiny game called Civilization, not very popular. But anyway, he defines a game as a series of interesting choices. So there you go. But I want to pause a little bit and talk about links. Because I think that when I first start kind of talking to people about Twine, I oftentimes say, like, the shorthand I'll use is like, this is like a choose your own adventure story, because people are familiar with that. They understand the concept, and that's totally a valid kind of thing to build. At the same time, you can do some really interesting things with links. So first of all, a link can connect to moments. For example, it lets you rewind, go backwards in time potentially, or forward to see the effects of an event. Lets you complicate an event, meaning you can imagine a scene where two people are talking and having an innocuous conversation. You click a link and you discover that these two people have been divorced for 10 years, and this is the first time they've talked with each other in that time. Or you could make an intuitive leap between two moments, similar to a match cut, perhaps in a movie or a film, where there is not an obvious connection between two moments, but something between them. Maybe there's something thematic that links them together, or something else that connects them that isn't necessarily strict, chronological progression. Likewise, a link can change things, or you can change links, or change things with links. You can change perspective. For example, in that scene with two people that I was just talking about, You could begin in the head of one of those people and tell the story from their perspective. Follow a link, find out what the other person is thinking about. You could use links to change facts about the narrative world. This is the one I think that people don't think of the most or overlook the most. So it could be something really basic. You could ask, well, what color is the sky at high noon? You could say, well, in the world that I'm envisioning, it's bright green or something like that. You can do things like that. You can also do something that's a little more emotionally driven, which is to say, like you could say, as an author, you could say to the player or the reader, you're estranged from your parents. Why is that? And you give them options as to why you don't get along with your parents. And based on that, the story changes. In short, I think links are underestimated as rhetorical tools. Something to think about is how many links do you click or tap on in one given day, right? We don't really think much about you click the link, follow the link. And most of the time you just learn more information. That's usually what links do. But they have a whole different there's a whole range of things you can do with them. So oftentimes people, when I kind of introduce Twine to them, they'll be like, can you build puzzles with Twine? Yes. Can you have an inventory of objects you carry around and do things with? Totally. Can you have battles where you fight big dragons in Twine? Mm-hmm. Can you make an FMV game where you have a bunch of movies and you can control how the movie changes and stuff like that? Can you do that in Twine? Yep. Can you make Minecraft in Twine? Yes, but I wouldn't recommend it. The short version is anything you can do in a web browser, you can do with Twine. And if you're really curious about that, if that aspect is interesting to you, there's an online resource, again, I'll have a link at the end, called the Twine Cookbook. And it's just kind of what it says, which is that it has a bunch of recipes that people in the community have contributed. Things like, I want to have an inventory of objects. Well, here's some code you can copy and paste and also adapt for your own needs. But before that, before you get complicated and start designing Fortnite in Twine, I want you to take a minute and think about what you can create, what you could, if you want to give it a shot this very minute, because I believe there is something that doesn't require learning any of these programming things. So first of all, you could tell a personal story. So one of the earliest things I did with Twine was I experienced when I was about the age of most of folks in the audience, I had something called a vasovagal syncope, which is a long, complicated way of saying that I fainted. But it was very scary because this fainting presented like a seizure. What happened was I was eating lunch at work and I ate something that was too hot. My eyes rolled back into my head, my arms started twitching, and I fell out of my chair unconscious. It was really scary because it looked like I had had a seizure. It turned out, fortunately, I had not, and there wasn't anything exactly wrong with me. It was because I wasn't taking care of myself. But what I did was to try to work through this really strange and frightening experience was I built something that tried to simulate in language and interaction what the experience of having that syncope was like. Because it wasn't like falling asleep. It wasn't, I've never had a seizure, I don't believe, so I don't know I don't have a point of comparison, but it was something I'd never experienced before. And so what I tried really hard to do was to give a sense of confusion through the interaction. And that to me was like a thing that was exciting in the sense of it was something that I could do with Twine that I would not be able to do with linear fiction, for example. Your story doesn't have to be as scary or complicated as this, but there's lots of opportunities there. You could let people explore a place that you imagine. It could be a big, complicated fantasy world with dragons and magic and things that you've maybe drawn maps of in the corners of pieces of paper and things like that. Or it could be a place from your childhood that isn't the same as it was when you first experienced it, and you can kind of capture it in language. Interactive media is really, really good at letting people wander around a space and experience it that way. And so you could do that with Twine. You can do that with language. Or you could just make a really funny joke. These are just some ideas. It doesn't have to be deadly serious, what you do. There's a couple of things I'd like to suggest looking at, if you're curious, while you're sort of hopefully thinking about things you might be able to make. Some things that I think are good examples to look at, or things that might spur some thinking. The first is a game called Birdland. And it is a YA story about where you are a kid at a summer camp that's being invaded by birds from another dimension. And it's a silly it's a fun story. I think the reason why I recommend it is that it has solid storytelling. And I think it's a good reminder that although interactive media has its own affordances and constraints, good storytelling is still good storytelling. No matter what you're doing, you still need those building blocks. And I think Birdland does a really good job with that storytelling. Second one is a game called Ultra Business Tycoon 3, written by Porpentine. I love the title. And it does the reason why I recommend it is that it does interesting stuff with narrative. So there's sort of two layers to it. This text that's not italicized here is a playthrough of a fictional game called Ultra Business Tycoon 3. And so your job inside of this game is to get rich, right? You're a business tycoon, that is your job. And you do that by doing sort of puzzly things. It's very lightweight. But the interesting part to me is this italicized part at the top. And it doesn't explain what's going on at first, I'll be honest, but I'll tell you a little bit, which is this italicized text is the thoughts of another character who's playing the game and is having a whole different experience. So they're thinking to themselves, the gaze at the top of the screen, $20,000, still not enough. And basically, as you progress things down here and do procedural things that make you richer with fake money, the emotional story up top changes and it becomes more complicated. And so I think it's an interesting approach on narrative. It would be difficult to do, I think. It's certainly, everything's possible in linear fiction, but I think it would be difficult to do. Another one I recommend is Queers in Love at the End of the World by Ananthropy. This is a game that actively resists you reading it and playing it. You only get 10 seconds to experience this game. There's a timer here. When that timer expires, the game is over, the world ends. And so you can read as quickly as you want to, click the links to do things, but no matter what, you get 10 seconds. And you can play it as many times as you want to. And so obviously it's a game, like there are not a lot of works out there that actively resist or force you to rush or pressure you in this way. I think it does really interesting things in that respect. The one comparison, I guess my bonus recommendation, is William Gibson, the guy who wrote Neuromancer, but you might know him. He wrote a digital story called Agrippa, and it was designed to be played once. It went on a floppy disk, and as soon as you played it, the story, or after you finished playing and reading the story, and it scrolled on its own. It wasn't like you could sit there and like take your time with it. It scrolled on its own, and when you reached the end, the story deleted itself. It was not possible to play or read again. Yeah, it was cool. The other secondary story, and I won't digress too much on this, but the other fascinating aspect was it was performed once. There was like a show that people bought tickets to see this story. And of course, guess what happens? It was videotaped. And so you can play, even though this thing was designed to be experienced once, of course, we live now in an age where now it's actually on YouTube. You can watch it whenever you feel like. And so I think it's interesting from an artistic standpoint. Anyways, digression. The final recommendation I have for you is a story called Silver and Gold. And in some ways, it's similar to the business tycoon thing I was showing you a second ago. But it's a little more freeform. There are two perspectives the story is being told from. Two sides of the story, in fact. And so the aspect is, or the thing about it is, it's like sort of like a puzzle. This is the beginning state of it. And so you begin not knowing what is going on at all. And hopefully, as you click through these things, that story becomes clear to you. You can choose. The interesting aspect to me is that it lets you, or it asks you to choose which story you want to progress. And they kind of coexist physically in the space. So if you click on the word frightened up top here or something like that, and then more text will appear, but the text on the right will continue to be visible. And so by the time you finish it, you have perhaps two finished stories side by side. So something maybe you noticed. None of those stories that I just talked about had puzzles, inventory, or RPG battles. Kind of. Ultra Business Tycoon does have puzzles. They're really easy, but that's sort of the point. But my point, high level, is that these are not things that are bad inherently, of course, but they're not necessarily things you have to create something interesting. But maybe you are a complicated person, and maybe you want to build big, complicated video games. That's understandable. I'm a big, complicated person too. I want to show you 2 examples of how you can potentially use Twine as a stepping stone. The first is Firewatch. Firewatch is a game, a narrative-based game. It takes place in it's 3D world. You wander around. There's voice acting, all kinds of things. But this is the prologue to it that you go through before you actually begin the game. And to me, this is really interesting because I think it says something, or has potential kind of applications for game makers too. This began life as an exercise for the team. They were working on a story together, and they were trying to figure out the main character. And so before they got into the world of 3D modeling and all those things and dialogue, they decided to build a version of the backstory in Twine. And their original intent was for this to be playable just by the team working on the game. And this was just a way for them to kind of get to a shared understanding about who the main character is. And that goes up to my point about sort of personal games. Like, it doesn't have to be necessarily, you don't have to build games necessarily for just your loved ones. It could be a thing that you do as an exercise with people you collaborate with, for example. Anyway, for whatever reason, I guess they did a really good job making this prologue. They decided it was compelling enough that they wanted to include it into the game itself. And this is what everybody experiences when they play Firewatch. It's not Twine per se. Like, Twine isn't running behind the scenes or anything like that. But it was basically, they scripted it out in Twine. Likewise, another one that I recommend, and the screenshot is very, very hard to make out. I apologize. It's just a very dark game, like visually dark. So this is really what you see. It's a game called Lifeline. There's actually like 5 of them, or probably even more than that, because it was very successful initially. And the setup behind Lifeline is that you get a message from it's a sci-fi kind of story. You get a message from an astronaut who's like, I just crash landed on some planet I don't know about. Like, I don't know what to do. What should I do? And then you tell them, like, well, go look at that hill far off on the horizon. Maybe there's something interesting. Or maybe you should go into the spaceship and try to gather supplies. That seems like a good idea. And the astronaut replies, okay, I'm gonna go do that. I'll see you in 2 hours. And then 2 hours take place. So it's a game you play usually on your phone, usually. And so it does storytelling in an ambient kind of way, right? Normally when we experience, or oftentimes when we experience stories, we do it in this intense, concentrated sort of way. You sit down, you open a book, you read it, you don't want people to bother you. You go to see a movie, you walk into a theater, the lights go down, everything is designed to focus your attention for 2-ish hours. Lifeline tries to tell a story in an ambient sort of way, meaning that you might, for example, like you wake up in the morning and you check in with your astronaut friend and you see how they're doing and talk about like whatever their situation is. And you give them some advice on what they should do next. And they're like, okay, I'll talk to you later. And then lunchtime, you go in and say like your astronaut friend found, some food in the back of the spaceship or something like that. And it coexists with your life in a really interesting way. Like, it tells that story while you yourself are living your life. It takes about, like, I've never really timed it out. I think it takes about 3 days in real time. And it's not particularly demanding in the way sometimes real-time games can be. It doesn't progress without your interaction. So you can choose, it doesn't take over your life. You don't have to like ignore your normal obligations to play this game or anything like that. This game was entirely scripted with Twine. They built it into a custom kind of engine with all the delays and stuff like that. But that was something that they used that as sort of the armature of their game. I want to close out with sort of 5 final pieces of advice for you. First of all, the only way to know if a game works is by having other people play it. Emphasis on other people. And that's just, to me, it's one of those things that becomes self-evident eventually, and perhaps even obvious. Just like if you're reading a play, like you can get a sense reading a play script if a play is interesting or has characters that are compelling. But in the end, you only know if it's a good play by watching it being performed. And games are the same exact way. It's like looking at sheet music and being like, pretty good song. It just doesn't make sense, or it doesn't work. I will say, of course, it's really, really difficult to do this. And unfortunately, it doesn't get easier. I can tell you now, like, I still have the same sort of fear when I put stuff in front of people that they won't like it. It's silly in some level. I know this is silly, but I still have those fears. And unfortunately, you just have to get over it, is unfortunately my advice. I think it's also really important to learn from other genres and media. Something that I see when people are first starting out making games, not everybody does, but there's some people who get really, really excited about making games. And they're like, making games is my life. That is what I want to do with myself. And in order to be the best game maker I possibly can, I'm going to play all the games I possibly can, and I'm going to dissect them, and I'm going to learn from them. And that's going to inform my own practice as a game maker. And it's sort of like half true. Yes, you do have to play games to be good at making games. Just like you have to read novels in order to be a novelist. That's how it works. But at the same time, what I see sometimes is folks are focused on games to the exclusion of other media. And it's sort of like leaving all this money on the table, as it were. There's so many things that you potentially draw on. And if you look at the really transformational games, the games that are huge landmarks, oftentimes they are drawing on or incorporating elements from totally disparate things. And I guess my tiny little suggestion is, in particular, don't neglect architecture. There's so much, like the physical, like architecture of buildings. There's so much that it can teach you. I think it's really important to think about things as experiments, especially when you're first starting out, and especially not masterpieces. A masterpiece can either be amazing, the best thing you've ever made, or terrible. An experiment can succeed or fail, but it will teach you something no matter what. And I think that's a much more valuable way to look at things, because honestly, like the Ira Glass quote, when you first start out, the things you make probably will disappoint you on some level. And that's unfortunately inevitable. I think it's better if you think of it as an experiment that you learn from. I hope my talk isn't too negative. I know I've spent a lot of time telling you can't make Fortnite. I think I've said that at least 3 or 4 times. That's not to say that you can eventually. And I still think, and I don't want you to think like, okay, you've crushed all my dreams. I really hope that. I think it's important that you still hold on to those big ideas, because there will come a time when it will make sense for you to make them. And finally, I want to end with, interesting is better than good. In addition to the games I've made myself, I also have taught in game design programs myself. And I will tell you, I enjoy 1,000 times more playing a game that is flawed, but has something interesting going on with it, that does something new or unusual, than playing an absolutely mediocre platformer game. I have played many, I had all respect to I was teaching beginner level classes. And so my students built a lot of mediocre platformer games, for example. Nothing against them. That's where they were at their stage of development. I was way more interested in the stuff that was janky and weird, but did something really interesting. So that's what I have for you today. So thank you for listening. Here are a million links. The top 2 is the website for Twine. Underneath that is my personal website. This is the essay by Porpentine, Creation Under Capitalism, I super recommend. And then the rest of these are the games I've recommended taking a look at. So thank you. Okay, so just repeating, because for the recording, that the question is sort of like, you get excited about a game idea yourself, you think it's fun, but then it turns out other people don't enjoy it. And how you kind of work through that? Well, I think high level, I suppose my advice would be, I'm not arguing that you distrust yourself and you're like, never mind, it sucks, right? However, there's something, the advice that I tend to say is that when someone tells you that something isn't working for them, you should believe them. When they tell you how to fix it, do not agree with, or do not believe them. And testers do this all the time. They're like, it'd be better is if I got $500 to start out the game instead of 200. What you have to listen to and hear is I wish I had more resources in this game, potentially. And so you have to triangulate, and the more viewpoints you get, the easier it gets. I also think that you have to have some kind of core belief in your idea. It may end up being, it depends on sort of the level of feedback you're getting. If it feels like it's just not resonating with people at all yet, then maybe you put it on the shelf and come back to it later. Like another thing that happens to me all the time is it feels like really a little scary at the time. Is like I'll grab like 3 different ideas that didn't work in the past, and eventually they'll migrate into something I do later. And it's scary because it's just like, well, what happens the next time when I run out of ideas, right? How empty is my shelf going to be? So it's situational, but I think of course you have to continue to believe in yourself. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Recommendations for people who are not good at programming. I mean, first of all, I want to question the premise slightly, in the sense of like, I think people get intimidated by programming quite a bit. And the thing is, I'm going to like Unity especially. Unreal is scary because you either write C++ code or you're doing like visual diagrams. Unity presents a friendlier sort of facade and it looks like it ought to be easier to learn, but it isn't actually that easy. And so I wouldn't get too discouraged right out of the gate if you run into trouble with it. I wouldn't necessarily take that as like, oh, I guess I'm not good at programming, right? It's a skill just like anything else. So, but keeping that in mind, like, well, how do you be productive even so? I think some of the things I showed like are very low code tools. For example, let me rewind a million slides here. Like Bitsy, for example, is very, very low code in the sense that you're dragging stuff around, you're drawing a world, things like that. Script less so. RenPy is written in Python, so it can be a little crunchy to get used to. But the other big piece of advice I would have for you is make a friend, right? You don't necessarily need 2,000 friends or whatever it was. I lost the slide, but you don't need 2,000 friends, but maybe you could find 1 or 2 people. I mean, making games is a lot like, to me, it reminds me so much of being in a band, right? You can be a solo artist. You can pick up your guitar and, play a coffee house, but oftentimes you need a team around you because it's just the number of skills that you need to make a game are so broad that it's going to be very, very difficult to be good at all of them. I guess it's possible. There are examples of games that are solo efforts where somebody more or less did everything. And there's some really impressive results as a result. But more often than not, make a friend. That's my real advice. And if you need help making a friend, go to a game jam. If you're not familiar, game jams basically are events. They're very time limited, usually like 48 hours or something like that. The big ones are Ludum Dare, which I never know how to pronounce correctly, or Global Game Jam. And the whole point is that you can go to these events. They give you a theme to build the game around. And you can say like, I am good at art, or I like designing levels or something like that. And you can on the spot find somebody to work with. And ideally it's sort of like a first date almost, or a blind date in terms of creativity. Maybe if you enjoy working with this person on a game jam or in a game jam context, then you can continue kind of talking. If not, it was just a 48-hour thing. So it is a lot like a first date. Good question also. Yeah, so can you build some other kind of front end in front of Twine? Absolutely. There are plugins, for example, for Unity, for Unity, that will take a story you've built in Twine, and like, for example, if you want to have that do all the dialogue in your game, it'll help you do that. You can, of course, build your own thing. Because the data itself is in HTML, so you can do whatever, like you could parse that out and do whatever presentation you felt like. Sure. So the question was sort of how do you survive? Because the video game industry is so big, people are making games, like a billion games in general. How do you get any kind of visibility? That's like almost like a whole other topic unto itself, or talk unto itself, to be honest. Like that's like an hour, right? I can't say that I'm an expert on this sort of thing. So I would sort of, first of all, say, take what I say with a grain of salt. Like there's the very cold, hard marketing aspect of things. But I would also, to me, high level is when you're building small games, to me, the key is finding those people who are interested in the kind of game you're building. So for example, like right out of the gate, because I'm building things that are text-based primarily, there's like graphics and whatnot, but you're doing a lot of reading. That's going to cuts my audience down potentially a good bit depending. And so finding like just figuring out where that community is, and that's going to be, the answer to that is really, really dependent on the type of community it is. Like oftentimes what I would suggest is look at similar games to the games that you yourself are building or interested in, and see where the people, see how the people who played those games found out about those games. And that can be one place to, and that would at least kind of guide you towards it. Yeah, but it's a very, very difficult problem. It's one of the biggest problems in general, because that's the thing. It's the natural sort of outcome of having these tools become free, is that it's just, there's a million things out there for people to try, and it's really difficult to get heard or seen in that big mass, you know? Yeah, I agree. Let me answer your second question, because I think that has an easier answer. Should games that become, because inevitably there's going to be security issues. I guess it depends. Like, you're thinking of online games. Yeah. Like, should they go away to keep the world safe? I guess. That is also a question I feel unequipped to answer, and that's why it's a short answer. The question you're asking really touches on the idea of game preservation, right? Because especially for these online games, to me, I don't mean this in a bad way, they resemble theme parks or other kinds of experiences. Because first of all, there's a particular environment they exist in, but also there's a community that they coexist in. So for example, like you could recreate World of Warcraft, and people have, but without the thousands of people playing it right beside you, then you could argue, like, are you really having the World of Warcraft experience? And so it's a very, very tricky question. I think ultimately things deserve to be preserved in some shape or form. What that shape or form looks like is for better or smarter people than me to say. Your first question was about add-ons and custom content. Do you mean like DLC that I make, the person makes, or like allowing community people to build stuff? Oh, okay. And your question was, do I think it's a good idea or a bad idea?
Like creating more story, reaching to like a wider audience of people.
So the question, high level, just repeating it for the recording. The question is about, you know, allowing community mods, things like that, to extend a game, and does that mess with the original vision?
Yeah.
I think it depends, I suppose. Right? It's not like a cut and dried yes no kind of answer. I think in general I'm very much in favor of communal work, meaning that obviously at least I personally believe that when you put something out in the world, what people do with it is kind of like you don't get to say. Right? Just as like if I publish a book and somebody decides I'm going to set your book on fire, well, so be it. Like that's the way it is. It gets messier with copyright and intellectual property law and all that stuff, which I don't really want to delve into. I'm not a huge fan of that either, but I don't think the copyright is inherently bad or anything like that. I do think that some really interesting work happens in that mod space. And actually, to the other question about like what to do if you're not great at programming, or if you feel like your programming skills aren't great, modding games can be a really good thing to do, because oftentimes there are tools that people have built to help out with that, and you're not starting from scratch. You obviously have something to work with from the beginning of things. And so in general, I'm in favor of it. Whether it messes with the integrity of the story or not, I'm fairly confident that people are smart enough to understand, like, well, this was the story originally as it was intended by the creators. And yes, I plugged in this mod that turns everybody into Thomas the Tank Engine or whatever. Like, that doesn't mess with my original understanding of the game, right? Just as fan fiction doesn't really, you know, like, it exists, it coexists with things. It doesn't change or somehow diminish the original work. Yeah. So the question is sort of about like, how do you manage scope? You know, the fancy word for this is combinatorial explosion. You can use this with your friends. Meaning, like, it's the classic thing of like rabbits, you know, multiplying. If you let people make two choices, you know, after 4 choices, you're at 16 different endings, if I do the math right. And, you know, from there, it just keeps on getting much, much bigger. Can you imagine writing 64 endings and stuff like that? And also letting that, or causing that to kind of let the project get away from you, and you don't kind of finish things because you're way down deep in this weird branch or something like that. So that's a really tricky one also. I think the 2 things that I do personally is, first of all, I do a lot of writing on paper, but that's also because I'm old, to be honest. Writing longhand for some reason is a different, you know, mental process for me. I've found than typing. And it discourages me from fidgeting on language, meaning like, I don't like that sentence 100%, I'm going to redo it or something like that. And just sort of focusing on momentum over getting it 100% right. And that's my own kind of tendency I have to fight against. The second thing I do is I write, and I think I borrowed this advice from Emily Short, who's an amazing narrative designer who I think you should also follow, and is way smarter than me. She talks about writing the through line first, meaning just write one playthrough. And you can sort of just say to yourself, yep, there's going to be other choices along the way and some other things might happen, but here's the main playthrough. I wouldn't say it the true ending. I hate the phrase true endings because I think it just prejudices people in your own thinking as an author. Like I feel there really should not be the true ending to any game, but that's a whole other topic. Point being is once you have that first through line and beginning, middle, end, that gives you a ton of confidence because first of all, it's something you can show to people now, right? You can get feedback, that loop, I was talking about, that iterative loop, but also it gives you confidence in your own work that you're like, okay, even if I decide I am just done writing or I don't like this anymore, I can just delete these extra choices and now I have a completed game. Yeah, but it's a really hard challenge. Yeah. All right, well, thank you very much again.